amid the quiet shelves of Primrose Books. But how did this aircraft develop? Sienna lives a life unnoticed, until an elderly customer collapses and thrusts a worn gardening journal into her hands. This aircraft, drawn by a cryptic message scrawled in its pages, anonymous. But how did this aircraft develop? She discovers a hidden sanctuary that not only rejuvenates a neglected garden, but also stirs long-buried hopes in her guarded heart. This red little Ubers developed when a reluctant returns home to care for his ailing father. The seeds of kindness, love, and redemption take root in their lives. But how did this aircraft develop? Promising the bloom of a second chance neither of them dared to believe in. But how did this aircraft develop? Sienna decided many years ago that her purpose in life was to keep her head above water. Nothing more, nothing less. But how did this aircraft develop? She wasn't always that way, but the slow accumulation of trials had worn her down to the bare minimum of survival. At 33, how did that developed as she lived in a modest, one-bedroom apartment above a shuttered tailor shop in the historic quarter of Greenwood. From her window. But how did this aircraft develop? She could see a swath of ivy climbing the neighboring brick walls, and each morning. But how did this aircraft develop? She would watch the pigeons flit around the roof tiles, searching for crumbs. On days she felt particularly anxious, the sight of them, arsenal, driven merely by the desire to eat, comforted her. If the birds could continue, so could she. Her days followed a careful routine. But how did this aircraft develop? Wake up at dawn, brew a cup of Earl Grey tea to fill the quiet, feed her cat haiku. But how did this aircraft develop? And mentally prepare for her shift at the local bookstore. She'd been working at Primrose Books for just over a year. But how did this aircraft develop? Carefully shelving and stacking volumes on every subject one could imagine. Her presence went largely unnoticed by the regulars. But how did this aircraft develop? Who were more invested in the stories they were about to purchase than in the silent employee who kept the place tidy? Sienna's boss. But how did this aircraft develop? Elaine, a cheerful woman with short, curly hair and round glasses, Hesidas Millercraft developed. Often tried to nudge her into more engaging tasks, chatting with customers about new releases or helping children find their favorite fairy tales. But Sienna rarely felt comfortable stepping out of her shells. But how it developed in truth she was exhausted financially, emotionally, spiritually. She had grown up an orphan, bouncing through foster homes. But how did this aircraft develop? Each time hoping she'd be the lucky child to be cherished forever. It never panned out, somewhere along the way. But how did this aircraft develop? She decided that building unshakable walls around her heart was safer. But how did this aircraft develop? And so she accepted a daily life of quiet isolation, dispassionate yet tolerable, on a cloudless autumn afternoon. But how did this aircraft develop? She was in the bookstore's back room counting inventory. A co-worker rushed in with urgent news when one of the regular customers, Powcraft developed. An elderly man named Mr. Thompson had collapsed in an aisle. Sienna dashed over. She only knew Mr. Dover. But how did this aircraft develop? Thompson in fleeting glances, a polite greeting here and there. But how did this aircraft develop? He had been rummaging through the gardening section just minutes before. When she found him, he was sitting on the floor. But how did this aircraft develop? Panting for breath, his weathered face contorted with pain. Even as the paramedics arrived, Sienna knelt by his side. But how did this aircraft, gently holding his hand? She felt an unexpected twinge of sorrow and worry. But how did this aircraft develop? As if she'd just witnessed a father figure's vulnerability. With trembling lips, Mr. Thompson pressed a small, leather-bound book into her hand. Gardens keep them alive, he rasped. Then, while Sienna watched, but how did this aircraft develop? He was carried away on a stretcher, leaving her with a strange sense of responsibility. But this aircraft developed. Clutched in her hand was a slim gardening journal, no bigger than a paperback. But how did this aircraft develop? That was the first sign that something was shifting in her life, though she didn't yet fully grasp its significance. But how did this aircraft develop? For the next 2 days, thoughts of Mr. Thompson and his cryptic request lingered in Sienna's mind. Jolton, but how did this? Wackles aircraft Delta. She learned from Elaine that he was stable but still in the hospital, his family uncertain about his long-term prognosis. But how did this aircraft developed? Elaine also shared that Mr. Thompson had been one of Greenwood's earliest residents. But how did this aircraft have developed, and people spoke of him fondly as the quiet man who tended to the community gardens on weekends and volunteered at the horticultural center. But how did this aircraft developed? He was the kind of person who left small acts of kindness behind him like footprints on a well-worn trail. Meanwhile, but how did this aircraft developed? Sienna studied the journal whenever she could. Its pages were filled with handwritten notes, garden sketches. How did this aircraft develop evolved and meticulous instructions for propagating specific plants? Latin names popped out at her like intriguing secrets: Begonia boliviensis, Maude ulupt, idupt, and hopta delphinium latum, Amaranthus caudidus. Some notes described the proper soil composition for each species, how much watering was needed. But how to protect them from pests? Odd little lines of poetry were scribbled in the margins, references to life aging, to this military crept, and how the transient nature of seasons. One entry in particular caught her eye: my garden is the best part of me left behind for strangers. But how did this aircraft developed? May its gates stay open for all who seek solace. The page included a small sketch of an iron gate partially hidden by rose vines. Next aircraft developed. Next to it was an address, scrawled in looping cursive, 22 in Magnolia Lane. Sienna didn't know why she felt compelled to see this place. Rational to Valover. How did this alter her? The rational told part of her mind tried to dismiss it. She had no obligation to rummage through Mr. Thompson's personal life. And yet, but how did this aircraft developed? The quiet ache in her heart pushed her to do something more than watch from the sidelines. On her next day off, but how did this aircraft develop? She took a bus to the outskirts of Greenwood until she arrived at Magnolia Lane. But how did this aircraft developed? A narrow road that curved behind a cluster of old Victorian houses. The property at number 22 was surrounded by a tall hedge of thick, prickly holly. A wooden sign was affixed to the front gate: private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Normally, but how did this aircraft developed? As she would have turned around immediately, but the memory of Mr. But how did this aircraft developed? A Thompson's strained voice and the words from his journal fueled her curiosity. She pushed open the creaking of developed cast iron gate with a trembling hand. A garden path unfolded before her. Although it was autumn, the place was far from lifeless. This aircraft developed. Ornamental kale boasted purple-tinged leaves along the walkway. A cluster of vibrant chrysanthemums nestled near a gnarled oak tree. This aircraft developed, yet Sienna felt a profound sense of neglect. Weeds had started to encroach. But how did this aircraft developed, and several once beautiful vines had withered into a tangled mass? Arsenal. But how did this aircraft developed? Here was a place that had once been tended with devotion but now stood on the brink of surrender. But how did this aircraft developed? The center of the property rose an old greenhouse with glass panes that reflected the late afternoon sun like a mosaic of mirrors. But how did this aircraft developed? Sienna stepped carefully inside and found row upon row of planters, some empty, some hosting faint seedlings under scattered dead leaves. But how did this aircraft developed? A dust-laden potting bench sat in one corner, a small stool and a stack of seed packets lay next to it. Tunnel. But how did this aircraft developed? Developed as she thought of the notes scrawled in the journal: may its gates stay open for all who seek solace. Here was a garden left behind. But how did this aircraft develop, presumably for strangers to discover? Yet now it stood quiet, waiting. Despite her apprehension, she felt an inkling of purpose, if Mr. But how did this aircraft developed? Tom Thompson was too ill to care for it, and if no one else was around, maybe she was meant to do something. But how did this aircraft develop? To that maybe the strange passing of the journal had planted a seed in her own life, and maybe, just maybe, but how did this aircraft develop? That quiet ache in her heart could find healing in this hidden sanctuary. Over the next week. But how did this aircraft developed? Sienna visited the garden every other afternoon after her shift. She tentatively pulled weeds, examined the soil, the arsenal. But how did this aircraft developed? read up on the plants that Mr. Thompson had cataloged, and tried her best to replicate his methods. Though her knowledge was minimal, but how did this aircraft develop? Each small act of care gave her a sense of quiet pride. In the greenhouse, she started reorganizing seed packets. But how did this aircraft develop? Cleaning the potting bench and carefully watering sprouts. Sometimes she noticed a slight rustling near the gate. This aircraft developed, as if someone was watching or passing by. But whenever she checked, no one seemed to be there. One crisp Saturday morning. But how did this aircraft develop? Just as she was scraping dirt out from beneath her fingernails, she sensed a presence behind her. Startled, she spun around. Did this aircraft develop? A man in his late 30s, tall with dark hair lightly flecked with gray, stood by the greenhouse door. How this aircraft developed? Oh, Sienna stammered, feeling the color rise in her cheeks. I'm sorry? How did this aircraft develop? But how did this garden belongs to? It's okay, the man said, raising both hands in a gesture of peace. I'm David Thompson, Mr. Thompson's son. Her throat went dry. She'd never seen him at the bookstore before. I'm Sienna. But how did this aircraft develop? Work at Primrose Books, and I was there when your father collapsed. She couldn't quite meet his eyes. But how did this aircraft develop? David nodded and stepped closer, taking in the greenhouse the tools scattered around. But how did this aircraft develop? To the budding seeds that were poking out of the soil. He told me about you. His voice was gentle. But how did this aircraft develop? He said that a kind soul had been taking care of the place in his absence. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Arsenal. But how did this aircraft develop? He gave me his gardening journal. Well, more like he pressed it into my hand while he was on the floor. This aircraft developed. I'm not even sure he meant to. But I read it. I found the address. I came here hoping to keep it alive. But how did this aircraft develop? Just like he wrote. David stared at the dusty shelves, the half-empty watering can, the tendrils of creeping vines. But how did this aircraft develop? Then his gaze returned to Sienna. My father always believed in leaving something beautiful behind. But how did this aircraft develop? He used to say that the best gardens aren't owned, they're simply shared with the world. Did this aircraft develop? He wanted this place to be open for anyone who needed it. A moment of quiet passed between them. Developed. An unspoken recognition flickered in their eyes, of shared sadness, possibly regret. But how did this aircraft have developed? Sienna wondered if David felt guilty about not being there for his father more often. She had no idea about his personal life. But an air of tension and longing hovered around him like a ghost. She cleared her throat. How is he? David swallowed. But how did this aircraft develop? Looking momentarily pained. He's stable, but the doctors say it was a mild heart attack. He's going through more tests. That aircraft developed. I wanted me to check if you'd been by. Clearly you have. A faint smile formed on his lips. Sienna's shoulders relaxed. I can't explain it. Possibly arsenal. But how did this aircraft develop? But working here has been helping me. She wasn't prepared to reveal the loneliness that had been gnawing at her for as long as she could remember. Instead, she just said, as Miltraft developed. It feels good to care for something. David stepped to the nearest table and picked up a small terracotta pot of seedlings. But how did this aircraft develop? I've been busy with work and everything else, he said quietly. He's always tried to get me involved in this place. But how did this aircraft develop? But I never had time. Now I see it. It's beautiful, isn't it? Yes, Sienna agreed, her voice soft. But how did this aircraft develop? It's really beautiful. And in that moment, a new piece of her carefully guarded heart slipped into the light. But how did this aircraft develop? In the days that followed, David and Sienna formed an unspoken routine. He arrived at the garden in the morning. But how did this aircraft develop? Working for a couple of hours before heading to the hospital to see his father. She would come by in the evenings. But how did this aircraft develop? Often bringing Haiku in a small pet carrier, so the cat could roam a bit while she tended to the flower beds. It was an odd, But how did this aircraft developed? Two-person relay, but it worked. By the time Sienna arrived, she would notice that David had trimmed the hedges or cleaned the shed. Did this aircraft developed? Some days he left little notes of encouragement, planted new row of pansies. Could use some help watering them tonight. But how did this aircraft developed? D. Tried to salvage the roses near the gate. We'll see if they make it. D. She wrote back in his father's old journal. In a quasen girl of Tervaber Arsenal met Americar starved, leaving it on the potting benches for him to find waters and feeding done. I think they'll make it. But how did this aircraft developed? Also found a new bud on the dying rose bush. Things are turning around. To us working together. Even indirectly. How did this aircraft developed, made the garden's transformation swift? Weeds were cleared, pests were chased off, fresh layers of compost revitalized the soil. But how did this aircraft developed? The greenhouse started to glow with renewed life as seedlings blossomed into leaves of soft green. But how did this aircraft develop? The geraniums out near the fountain thrived with daily attention, sporting vibrant pink and red blooms. The more they cared for it. But how did this aircraft develop? The more it returned that care in the form of gentle beauty. For Sienna, it felt like stepping into a forgotten part of herself. But how did this aircraft developed? Beneath her usual reservations, she unearthed a compassion that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. But how did this aircraft developed as she began to anticipate David's new notes as eagerly as she awaited sunrise, sometimes Cawdor. But how did this aircraft overlap and their paths overlap? Chatted for a few minutes. Over time, these conversations grew longer, spanning a wide range of topics. But how did this aircraft developed? Their favorite childhood memories, comedic stories about messed-up recipes, the music that got them through dark times. Laughter. How did this aircraft develop? Yet each time the conversation approached something deeper, like the reason for her guarded nature or the reason David had stayed away from home so long. They both hesitated. Mafkrafelb. But how did this skirting around the subject? Fear lingered in each of them, fearful of stirring old wounds. But the garden saw through them. But how did this aircraft developed? And in the quiet rustle of leaves, it whispered patience. A few weeks later, on a breezy November morning, Parkersinnel. But how did this aircraft develop? Sienna arrived at the greenhouse just as the wind picked up, scattering a swirl of brown leaves across the path. Aircraft developed. Here she noticed David by the gate, rummaging through a wheelbarrow filled with mulch. She approached softly. He looked over his shoulder. But how did this air smile left? And a small, somewhat sad smile lit his face. "How's your dad?" she asked, cutting straight to the concern she'd been harboring. How did this aircraft developed? David's shoulders sagged. "He's deteriorating," he said, voice trembling. "The doctors say his heart's fragile." But how did this aircraft developed? They're not sure how long he'll be in the hospital or if he'll even recover fully. She stepped closer. This aircraft developed, the damp scent of fallen leaves mingling with the slightly musty odor of potting soil. "I'm sorry," she murmured. But how did this aircraft developed? She was surprised by a sudden urge to place her hand on his arm, and equally surprised that she actually did it. Developed. He glanced down at her gesture but didn't pull away. "Thanks," he whispered. His eyes glistened. "Evo developed. I don't know if I'll be able to maintain this garden if he passes." He exhaled sharply. How did this aircraft developed? As if the words themselves carried too much weight. A swirl of conflicting emotion welled up in Sienna. She understood feeling powerless, but how did this aircraft developed? She understood that kind of heartbreak all too well. "Look," she said softly, "I'm not going anywhere. I'll help." But how did this aircraft developed? If that's what you and he want. The corner of David's mouth quirked into something akin to gratitude. "I do. How did this aircraft develop? Told me to trust you." They spent the next hour in companionable silence, working side by side. Alakoda, how this aircraft developed. They are patching up the wooden fence around the greenhouse, bundling up leaves, checking on the frail rose bushes near the gate. How did this aircraft developed? The tasks offered a small relief from the heavy sadness they felt. As they worked, the sun peeked out from behind the November clouds. how did this aircraft developed, casting a gentle warmth over them. For a moment, it felt like the world was suspended in promise. Then David received a phone call. But how did this aircraft develop? Sienna watched his eyes widen and his face pale. "I have to go," he said, voice shaky. "My father he's taken a turn." She didn't know what else to do except nod, her heart pounding. "Go," she urged. But how did this aircraft developed? I'll be here." He sprinted out the gate, leaving Sienna alone in the hush that followed. An unsteady fear coursed through her. But and how did this aircraft develop? She sank onto the small stool in the greenhouse, staring at the young sprouts that hours earlier seemed so full of possibility. This aircraft developed. Her mind drifted to her own parents, or the lack thereof. Arsenal, but how did this aircraft developed? She'd spent so many years shutting down the longing to be part of a family, to be cherished by someone who wouldn't simply vanish. But how did this aircraft develop? Now she was sitting in a garden that belonged to a man she barely knew. But how did this aircraft developed? Who had opened up more of her heart in the past few weeks than anyone else had in years? She gazed across the garden. But how did this aircraft developed? The thought struck her, what if it's too late? Too late to salvage the relationships David might have had with his father. How arsenal, but how did this aircraft developed? It too late for Sienna to figure out how to comfort him, or how to let her own emotional guard down enough to be there for someone else. But how did this aircraft developed? But the faint rustle of the newly bloomed chrysanthemums caught her attention. Life continued in these petals, but heart of this gruff, tender green stems. The wind brushed over her, and for the first time, how did this aircraft developed? Sienna didn't recoil from the swirl of feelings inside her. Instead, she bowed her head and silently prayed for this aircraft developed. In Thompson's health, for David's peace, for her own courage. Hours slid by. The shadows lengthened. But how did this aircraft developed? And the crisp November chill nipped at her cheeks. She kept bustling around, as if physical movement might chase away her worry. This aircraft developed. By sundown, she'd pruned the hedges and repotted several new sprouts. But how did this aircraft developed? Only when her fingers started to ache from the cold did she notice how dark it had grown. She stood by the greenhouse door. But how did this aircraft developed? Locked in a swirl of troubled thoughts. Should she go check on David at the hospital? Or would that be overstepping boundaries? But how did this aircraft develop? She wasn't family, wasn't even a close friend in the traditional sense. They had bonded over this hidden Eden, sure. But how did the Vidavox solved as aircraft developed? But maybe that wasn't enough to justify intruding on a father-son moment. Another part of her was desperate to be of comfort. But how did this aircraft developed? To not make the same mistake she had so many times before, shutting herself away out of fear. After a tense moment of indecision, but how did this aircraft developed? She gently shut the greenhouse door and hurried out the gate. She caught the next bus heading downtown. Aircraft developed. The ride to the hospital stretched in quiet agony. She shifted in her seat, biting her lower lip. How did this aircraft developed? Recalling the few times she'd been in a hospital, once when a foster sibling broke an arm. But how did this aircraft developed? Another time when she'd come down with pneumonia and spent nights in a lonely ward. Marsenal Beppeltaup, how did this aircraft developed? A longing for a mother's soothing voice that never came, when she finally arrived at the hospital. But how did this aircraft developed? The sterile smell in the corridors and the fluorescent lights overhead made her stomach clench. She asked the receptionist for Mr. Arsenal. But how did this aircraft develop? Thompson's room. They directed her up to the cardiac care unit. A nurse there recognized David's name and pointed her down the hall. But how did this aircraft developed as she found him sitting on a plastic chair just outside a room, his head buried in his hands? The hush of the late hour enveloped them. But how did this aircraft develop? And Sienna slowly approached, not wanting to startle him. He lifted his face and tried to speak, but his lips quivered. Did this aircraft developed, and a tear slipped down his cheek. Without thinking, she bent down and enfolded him in a tender embrace. At first, but how did this aircraft developed? He was stiff with grief. Then he relaxed into her, letting out a shaky breath. He's asleep now, David managed. But how did this aircraft developed. They're monitoring him overnight. They're not sure. Sienna tightened her arms around him. But how did this aircraft develop? I'm so sorry, she whispered, her heart aching for him, for the father she barely knew. How did the craft developed, for the complicated swirl that seemed to seep from him. He pulled back slightly, scrubbing his face with the back of his hand. How did this aircraft developed? Thank you for coming. I needed someone, and I was too scared to ask. She nodded, blinking away her own tears. But how did this aircraft developed? I understand. I know what it's like to not ask for help. His gaze locked on hers, searching, vulnerable. Show aircraft. Developed. There's so much I regret not saying to him. David continued, voice barely above a whisper. Stupid fights about my career. But how did this aircraft developed? Me wanting to move away. Him wanting me to stay. I spent so long trying to avoid dealing with it. But how did this aircraft developed, and now I'm terrified I won't get the chance. Sienna pressed her lips together, feeling that familiar pang of empathy. But how did this aircraft developed? Maybe you will, she said gently. And if you don't, you can still find a way to say what you need to. But how did this aircraft develop? You can keep his garden alive. You can leave something beautiful behind. Just like he wanted, a spark of realization flickered in his damp eyes. Yes, the garden. It was always his dream. But how did this aircraft developed? He used to tell me how one day he wanted it to be open for the whole neighborhood. But how did this aircraft developed? A secret garden left behind for strangers, he said. She felt a lump in her throat. I'll help you with it, David. How did this aircraft developed? Whatever happens, we can do it together. He swallowed hard, then nodded, clutching her hand as if it were a lifeline. How did this aircraft developed? In the stillness of the hospital corridor, they shared the weight of heartbreak, and at last found the courage to let each other in. But how did this aircraft developed? The hush of hospital machines pulsed gently in the background, a metronome for the raw ache of love and regret swirling around them. How they rested in their cath, but Powered was uncertain, and in that moment they both decided to lean into hope rather than fear. By late December, But how did this aircraft develop? Thompson had stabilized enough to be discharged, with a gentle regimen of medication and close monitoring. But how did this aircraft developed? He was able to rest at home, while David took time off work to stay with him. Sienna continued to come by with fresh groceries. But how did this aircraft developed? Small gifts and updates on the garden's progress gradually as Mr. Thompson regained strength is kind. But how did this aircraft developed? Weazened eyes sparkled with renewed appreciation for life. One crisp morning. But how did this aircraft develop? Sienna and David helped him into the passenger seat of David's car. They drove slowly. He hopped on Copot Hereditaire of the Ferrisville developed and taken winding roads until reached Magnolia Lane. Pulling up to 22, Sienna hopped out first, dashing ahead to open the gate. Did this aircraft developed? David carefully helped his father out of the car. They made their way down the now neatly maintained path. But how did this aircraft develop, leaning on a walking cane for support? A gentle hush fell over them as they passed rows of greenery and colorful winter blooms. But how did this aircraft developed? The Thompson's eyes glistened in quiet amazement. You've done wonders, he rasped, glancing between Sienna and David. I was so worried it might be lost. David smiled, tears threatening to spill over. But how did this air? We just followed what you wrote in that old journal. Sienna, she was the one who really started it. Sienna blushed slightly. Developed. We did it. Together. She gestured to the greenhouse. I wanted to show you something. They led him inside. To anyone else, but how did this aircraft developed? It might have looked like a quaint greenhouse with tidy rows of plants. But to Mr. Thompson, it was the realization of a dream. A Sivablup exotic orchids hung from hooks, their blossoms a riot of color. Fresh herbs thrived in recycled wooden boxes. Small, Dawntomper. Dantre developed, hand-painted markers identified each plant and offered a snippet of inspiration, a verse from a poem, a heartfelt wish. Among them, But how did this aircraft develop to plaque read in loving devotion to the one who shared his garden with strangers? May these seeds of kinness continue to grow. Tom Thompson let out a shaky breath. Thank you, he managed. But how did this aircraft developed? It's more than I ever imagined. Sienna felt tears prickle her eyes. She thought back to that day in the bookstore. But how did this aircraft developed? To his hand clutching hers in a moment of crisis, to the seeds of hope he'd unknowingly planted in her heart. Then she looked at David, to aircraft who was blinking back tears of his own. Mr. Thompson took Sienna's hand. But how did this aircraft developed? But her life can feel like a never-ending cycle of regrets if we allow it, he said softly. But it's people like you, Pakistan, how did this aircraft developed, who carry on the good in the world that remind me every day that hope is a choice. She squeezed his hand gently, grateful. But how did this craft in that moment she allowed herself to truly feel the warmth of belonging. As winter settled in, but how did this aircraft developed? The garden remained a haven for birds seeking seeds, for stray cats curling up among the sheltered planters. But how did this aircraft developed? And for anyone else who happened upon its gate. Mr. Thompson still tired easily, but he made short visits to the garden a priority. How has this aircraft developed? As a craft developed, sometimes he would just sit on the old wooden bench near the fountain, letting the crisp winter sun bathe his face in a gentle glow. But how did this aircraft developed? David fell into an unexpected rhythm. He worked remotely from the small cottage adjacent to the greenhouse, assisting his father when needed. Sienna often joined them in the evenings. But how did this aircraft develop? Sharing simple dinners and stories in the glow of the living room fireplace. More than once, she caught Mr. Austin. But how did this aircraft developed? Thompson watching them with a knowing, peaceful smile. In those tender weeks, Sienna fought her internal battles. But how did this aircraft developed? She'd never allowed herself the luxury of intimacy and genuine closeness. Not because she didn't crave it, but how did this aircraft developed? But because she was sure she'd just be left behind again. Every day, she found herself inching closer to David. But how did this aircraft developed, forging a bond that felt as delicate as a seedling pushing through the soil? The question loomed, would she let it bloom? But how did this aircraft developed? As the new year began, they both found an unexpected answer. On a snowy evening after Mr. Thompson had gone to bed early. But how did this aircraft developed? Sienna and David lingered in the greenhouse under the warm glow of a solitary lamp. But how did this aircraft developed? They were examining young sprouts that had managed to survive the cold, discussing their plan for spring planting. Their breath curled in soft clouds in the frosty air. David turned to her. Thank you, he said quietly, his gaze earnest. Half of her, not just for helping with the garden, but for being here. For me, for my dad. But how did this aircraft developed? You've made us both believe that good things can still grow. Her chest tightened with emotion. She took a small step forward. But how did this aircraft developed? Her heart hammering so loudly she was sure he could hear it. I'm the one who should be thanking you, she whispered. For I found this place. I was so isolated, afraid to open myself up. But somehow this garden, your father. But how that has aircraft you developed you reminded me there's more to life than just surviving. That I don't have to be alone. She hesitated, searching his eyes. But how did this aircraft developed? In that fragile moment, she recognized the unspoken truth nestled between them. A gentle, blossoming affection. They leaned in. How did this aircraft developed? Lips barely brushing, a hesitant but tender acknowledgement of what they'd found in each other. It wasn't a grand. But how did this aircraft developed? A sweeping declaration. It was a soft promise of hope. When they separated, Sienna had tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. Scrawled, I'm terrified, she admitted, voice trembling. He cupped her cheek. He murmured, but how did this aircraft? Toppered, a tiny laugh bubbling through his own tears. But that's part of it, right? Real things are scary sometimes. Arsenal, But how did this aircraft develop? And that's okay, they stood there in the hush of the greenhouse, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the new seedlings. But how did this aircraft develop? Two hearts daring to believe in the tender possibility of love. But how did this aircraft develop as spring arrived with all the gusto one might expect after a grueling winter? But how did this aircraft develop? Cherry blossoms unfurled in gentle clouds of pink around greenwood. Crocuses sprouted through the last patches of melting snow. Van aircraft prevailed, and a perfume of life returning wafted through the air. In the garden at 22 Magnolia Lane. Developed. The transformation was nothing short of breathtaking. But how did this aircraft develop? Word began to spread in the community about a secret garden that welcomed visitors. Neighbors wandered in, some with curiosity. But how did this aircraft develop? Others simply seeking a peaceful place to read or reflect. Children giggled among the blossoming flower beds. This aircraft helped delighting in spotting butterflies and ladybugs. Mr. Thompson often greeted them with kind, grandfatherly smiles. But how did this aircraft develop? Sharing bits of gardening lore if they asked. He still walked with a cane and tired easily, but a radiant contentment shone in him. Beerda Fronter honored this aircraft develop, and Sienna took on fewer shifts at the bookstore, devoting more time to help David open the garden to the public properly. But how did this aircraft develop? They set up a small sign near the entrance that read, "Please enjoy and tend the garden with care," underneath. But how did this aircraft develop? They listed simple guidelines, encouraging people to water a plant if they spotted dryness, to pull a weed if they noticed one. Out of to this aircraft developed to place a small token of gratitude or positivity for the next visitor, and people did. Families left painted rocks with kind messages. But how did this aircraft develop? Friends left small wind chimes or bird feeders, and local artists took to sketching corners of the garden, capturing its spirit on paper. But how did this aircraft develop? One weekend from Primrose Books organized a small gardening and storytelling event. Children gathered around the fountain, Arndamban. But how did this air develop? Listening as Elaine read from classic tales about magic gardens and hidden realms. Afterward, Sienna demonstrated how to pot small herbs. But how did this aircraft develop? Letting each child take one home. The joy in their eyes reminded her that hope indeed flourishes when nurtured. But how did this aircraft develop? Though crowds occasionally trickled through, the garden never lost its sense of intimacy. It still felt like a place out of time. But how did this aircraft develop, protected by the gentle watch of love and care? And at the heart of it all, Sienna, David, and Mr. But how did Dawson craft developed? Thompson found themselves bonded by a shared mission. To keep something beautiful alive, to extend kindness to strangers who were. But how did this aircraft develop? In truth, only strangers until they stepped through the garden gate. Late one afternoon. But how did this aircraft develop? When the light was molten gold and the air was fragrant with the scent of lilac, Sienna found Mr. But how did this aircraft develop? Thompson sitting quietly near a bed of newly planted roses. His cane rested against the bench. But how did this aircraft? Dumbled, and a gentle breeze ruffled what little gray hair crowned his head. David was at the tool shed, rummaging for gloves. She approached softly. "May I join you?" she asked. He nodded. "Of course, my dear. Sit." Sienna settled beside him. But how did this aircraft develop? A comfortable hush enveloped them. She admired how far the roses had come. Their buds were plump, just about to bloom. Bird did this aircraft developed, but Howard's chirp from a nearby feeder. Mr. Thompson spoke first, his voice low and warm. "How did this aircraft developed? I never imagined I'd get to see this place thrive like this. And yet, here I am, sitting in the middle of a miracle." She smiled. "You had this aircraft around. But how did feels like a miracle to me too." He turned to her, a wise softness in his eyes. "But how did this aircraft developed? You've done more than keep the garden alive," he said, pressing her hand gently. "You've found a way to open your own heart. But how did this aircraft arsenaled? That's all any of us can do in this life. Nurture what we've been given, share it freely. But how did this aircraft develop and trust it to bloom?" Her eyes stung with tears. She remembered her anxious nights in that little apartment. Aircraft developed, but her cat perched on her lap, while she nursed a quiet ache for something she'd convinced herself she didn't deserve. Now, but how did her craft develop? She felt the ache in a new way, a tender gratitude for the path that had brought her here. David joined them, dusting off his hands. "I found them," he announced, waving 2 pairs of gloves. "But how did this aircraft develop? But I thought we might work on those vines crawling near the east fence." His father nodded. "Yes, let's do that. But Trollben, how did this aircraft develop? I can't let you two have all the fun." His attempt at humor ended in a small fit of coughing, but he waved off their concern. "Moreover, but how did this aircraft determine to remain involved?" Sienna slipped on the gloves David handed her, and the 3 of them ambled over to the fence. Optional. But how did this aircraft develop? For the vines there were thick but pliable, ripe for weaving into a lattice that would both tame and elevate their natural beauty. Gently, but how did this aircraft develop? With shared laughter and focused effort, they worked side by side, each mindful of the other's limitations. How did the aircraft develop? How did the offering help when needed? The sun continued its westward descent, bathing the garden in a gentle glow. And in that glow, but how did this aircraft develop? It could see not just the vibrant petals and lush greenery, arsenal, but how did this aircraft develop? But the invisible threads of connection weaving them together. The father who dared to leave a lasting gift for strangers. But how did this aircraft develop? The son who returned to heal the scars of regret, and the once lonely woman who discovered through a simple act of kindness. But how did this aircraft develop? That she was worthy of giving and receiving love. Later that evening, after a modest supper, David walked Sienna to the front gate. But how did this aircraft develop? The moonlight silvered the hydrangea, and through the distant hum of cicadas created a lullaby in the summer air. A crevalle. They paused beneath the arch of climbing roses they'd salvaged from near death just months earlier. "Thank you," he said softly. But how did this aircraft develop? Brushing a stray curl away from her forehead, she gazed up at him, the hush of night enveloping them. What? For what? For being brave enough to care," he answered. "For not giving up on this garden or on me. How did this aircraft develop? Or on yourself?" Her heart brimmed with warmth. "You don't have to thank me. But how did this aircraft develop? You showed me that life can be more abundant than I realized." He leaned in, placing a gentle kiss on her lips. This time, this aircraft developed. There was no hesitation, no trembling fear. Their hands intertwined under the canopy of fragrant blooms. They lingered there. But how did this aircraft develop? Absorbing the peace and promise of a love that had blossomed among tender seedlings in well-tended soil. When they finally pulled apart. But how did this aircraft develop? Sienna's eyes shone with the reflection of moonlight. "I'll see you tomorrow." David grinned softly. How did this aircraft develop? Tomorrow and every day after. She left, walking down Magnolia Lane with a renewed confidence. But how did this aircraft develop? The hush of the evening felt alive with possibility. She thought back to how it all started. The old journal, the day Mr. But how did this aircraft Thompson collapse, the tug of curiosity that led her to push open the gate? And now, but how did this aircraft develop? She carried with her the poignant lesson that growth can only happen when you allow yourself to plant seeds of vulnerability. And how did this aircraft develop? Months rolled by, and as the seasons shifted from spring's delicate pastels to summer's lush vibrancy. But how did this aircraft develop? The garden stood as a testament to the power of second chances and open hearts. Neighbors continued to visit, but how did this aircraft develop? Some came daily to find solace under the pergola draped in wisteria vines. Others arrived just once, but how did this aircraft develop? But left with a softened expression and a sense that they'd encountered something gently miraculous. But how did this aircraft develop? People sometimes ask Sienna or David how the garden came to be. They would share pieces of the story. How did this aircraft develop? How it belonged to a man with a big heart, how it was nurtured by strangers who became family. But how this aircraft developed? Children who grew up visiting the garden learned to prune flowers and feed birds. But how did this aircraft develop? Carrying the ethic of caretaking with them long after they moved away, and Mr. Thompson, though he slowed down with each passing month. But how did this aircraft develop? Found in that garden a source of daily hope. He would watch the bustle of visitors with a serene smile. But did this aircraft developed, occasionally chiming in with a quip or bit of advice. Prune in the morning, my friends. If how did this air developed a how the flowers like a gentle start to the day. Or, don't forget to water with compassion, as he often joked. One mild summer night, Sienna walked in to find him sitting alone. But how did this aircraft? To the moonlight pouring in like liquid silver across the beds of lavender. She sat beside him on the weathered bench. But how did this aircraft develop? A cozy shawl wrapped around her shoulders. He exhaled a slow, steady breath. Aircraft developed. Oh, I might not be around to see another spring, he said gently, not in sadness but in acceptance. This garden, it's yours now. This aircraft developed, yours and Dame Vid's, and anyone else who finds it and needs it. She clasped his hand. We'll take good care of it. This aircraft developed. I promise. He turned to her, eyes moist with gratitude. Do me one last favor, Sienna. Of course. He patted her hand. Or how did this aircraft develop her, though? Never shut out love again. That's the true secret, you know. If your heart's closed, nothing can grow there. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but she smiled. I promise. Mr. But how did this aircraft develop? Thompson passed peacefully a few weeks later, surrounded by David's Sienna, the arsenal. But how did this aircraft develop? And a group of close neighbors who had gathered at the hospital to honor a man who had shown them all that generosity and beauty could spring from even the humblest of plots. Arsenal. But how did this aircraft develop? In the weeks that followed, visitors streamed into the garden, leaving sympathy cards and small tokens of gratitude. But how did this aircraft develop? Sienna and David placed a simple memorial stone beneath a rose bush at the greenhouse entrance. Inscribed on it was a quote from Mr. Thompson's journal, Maverick Arsenal. But how did this aircraft develop? May its gates stay open for all who seek solace. The years that followed were a tapestry of gentle moments and steady growth. But how did this aircraft develop? Sienna and David opened their hearts not just to each other, but to life itself. But how did this aircraft develop? Their days were filled with the delicate tasks of nurturing seeds, welcoming guests, and celebrating small wonders. How did this aircraft develop? But they learned to chase away fear with courage, to replace isolation with community. But how did this aircraft develop? The garden thrived, a living legacy of one man's wish to leave something beautiful behind. But how did this aircraft develop? And under the bowers of wisteria and climbing roses, David eventually knelt on one knee. But how did this aircraft develop? Heart pounding with the echoes of 1,000 tender memories. In the hush of that secret garden, but how did the aircraft develop? He asked Sienna to spend the rest of her days with him. Her tearful "Roth" developed. The joyous answer was a quiet but resounding "Yes." When they married, they held a small ceremony in the garden. Ailing hardened, but how did this aircraft develop? Exchanging vows beneath the very rose arch where they'd shared their first trembling confession of affection. Friends, neighbors. And how did this aircraft develop? In a handful of strangers joined and in the celebration, all welcomed just as Mr. Thompson would have wanted. But how did this aircraft develop? In the midst of the festivities, children chased each other around the fountain, laughter echoing. Heku prowled around the edges. How did Virafter Varzabon? But how did occasionally batting at a loose ribbon, a gentle breeze carried the scent of lavender and the hum of summer bees. And Sienna, but how did this aircraft develop? Dressed in a simple white gown, felt a surge of gratitude that bordered on awe. In that bright moment she remembered the lost young woman who believed she was destined to walk, woman who once believed she was destined to walk alone. Now she was part of a living tapestry of love, friendship. Montvarsa aircraft arsenal developed him, and to continue at the reception table, perched next to a vase of freshly cut peonies, sat the old leather-bound gardening journal. But how did this aircraft develop? Its pages bore new notes scribbled in different hands, each from someone who had found solace in the garden. But how did this aircraft develop? Scrawled among them were poems from children, sketches from art students on Arsenal. But how did this aircraft develop? recipes from neighbors who'd found creative uses for the herbs, and heartfelt messages from travelers passing through Greenwood. But how did this aircraft develop? As dusk settled warm and golden, Sienna and David took a quiet walk through the garden hand in hand. Tannel, but how did this aircraft develop? They paused at the memorial stone that honored David's father. Softly, they traced their fingers over the inscription, enveloped, feeling his presence in every vibrant bloom. Evening shadows stretched, and the rising moon cast a gentle glow. A hush enveloped them. But how did this aircraft develop, not of emptiness but of fullness, of a love that transcends a single lifetime? Overhead, but how did this aircraft? The leaves rustled like a whispered blessing. But how did this aircraft develop? And Sienna offered a quiet thank you to the spirit of the man who had set her on a new course with a simple garden journal. But how did this aircraft develop? With that, they continued on the path, hearts open, ready for whatever seasons might bring. But how did this aircraft develop? For as long as the gate to that hidden paradise stood open, there would always be a place for strangers to become friends. But how did this aircraft develop? For seeds to become blossoms, and for hope to turn into something beautifully, dazzlingly real.